Hi guys, someone on YouTube asked me how you can create a mute button for your Kontakt instruments that can be automated, because the one on the interface, this one here that comes standard with all your Kontakt instruments, if you right click on that, it just has the same effect as left clicking on it. You can't assign any automation to it, and you can't control it from a script. So what we're going to look at in this video is a couple of ways you can create a button that you can control from the script and that will have the effect of muting the instrument. And there's a few ways to do that, so we're going to look at more than one way, and we're also going to see how you can do it for a multi-instrument as well as just an individual instrument like this. So we'll start off with the individual instrument. So what I've got here is just a basic instrument, and I've mapped a single sample across pretty much most of the key range, so it doesn't sound very nice, but it's fine for our purposes just to demonstrate the idea. So there's two ways we can mute the instrument, or have the effect of muting the instrument, that will work for any instrument. First one is to just have the volume go to 0. And the second one is to ignore any incoming MIDI data, because all Kontakt instruments are driven by MIDI. If we just ignore the incoming data, it will not play anything. And we're going to look at both ways of doing it. So we'll start off with the volume method. So if we move on over to Sublime Text, it's going to be quite a simple script, but I'm still going to write it in Sublime just because it's easier to do. We're going to start with our onInit callback. And the first thing we need to do is declare a switch that we can put on the interface that's automatable. We're using a switch rather than a button because a button can't be automated by right-clicking on it like a switch can. And we'll just call it SWI mute, and there's our mute button. And basically what we want to happen is when the button's clicked, the volume goes to 0. So to do that, we just use the UI control callback, put the name of the control in there, that's our button, and then we set the engine parameter. And we could loop through each group and turn the volume of the groups down individually, but because we want to mute the whole instrument, we're just going to apply it to the main volume control of the instrument. So it's engine par volume, and the value we want is 0. The group, well, it isn't a group, it's the whole instrument, so we put -1. There are no slots, so we put -1, and it's not an insert or a send, so again we put -1. And that's the basic script to mute it. So if I paste that in, we'll get a button. The name's been scrambled, that's just because Sublime Text has compressed the variable names for us there, so we could set a name for that button if we wanted it to be more interesting. Because this is a switch, we can right click on it and control it via CC automation. And now if we click it, this volume control here is going to go down to 0. The only problem we have here is now if we click it again, the volume is still at 0. So what we've got to do is put in a little bit of code that remembers the volume before we've pressed the button and restores that value once we press the button again. So not much different to what we've got already. We'll just need a variable to store the volume. And then before we change the instrument's volume, we're going to save its current volume in our volume variable. And we're going to use the get engine par command for this, and it's very similar to the set one that we just used. Again, there is no group, there is no slot, and there is no generic. So now we're storing the value of the instrument's volume. Now all we've got to do is we're going to say if the button is on, we want it to do this code, the mute. So we'll say if the switch is 1, so if it's turned on, we're going to do this. And then we say else, which basically means otherwise. So if it isn't on, we're going to set the volume again, but instead of setting it to 0, we're going to set it to the volume that we have stored. Hit F5 to compile it and paste it into Kontakt. So now if the button's on, the volume's going to go to 0, which it is, and if we hit it again, it's going to restore it to its previous value. I hadn't reset the volume, so it's going to still be at 0, so let's just reset the volume there. Okay, so now we're at -6 dB. If I turn it on, it's going to go to 0, and if I turn it off, it's going to put it back up to -6 dB. So that's a simple way to make a volume mute button for Kontakt. And you could apply this to the groups if that's what you'd rather do, but I think it's just quicker just to apply it to the whole instrument. Now, the reason why I'm going to show you another method using MIDI is because this isn't necessarily the best method to use. It does mute the instrument, so if I press it and I play some keys, we're not going to hear anything coming out. But what we are going to get is we're going to get the voice count. You can see up here and over here where it says voices, the voice count is still being used, and up at the CPU meter we're getting a bit of CPU usage and disk usage. So this method is still using your computer's resources, and if you've got a lot of instruments loaded, that might be an important factor to take into consideration. If we're going to use the MIDI method, where we're just stopping in data coming in, we're not going to have any notes playing, we're going to stop it before it gets to that stage. That's going to be a bit more efficient because it's not going to use your voice count and it's not going to use as much CPU, and it won't use any disk because we're not playing back any samples. So we're going to look at that method now. So I'm going to bypass this script slot. We're going to move over to this one. This is where our MIDI blocking script will go. And if we go back to Sublime Text, I'll open a new one. And it's going to start pretty much the same way. We're going to have a switch. And we'll give it exactly the same name. But instead of going into the switches callback, we're going to go into on note. And we're going to say if the switch is on, we're going to ignore any incoming MIDI data. So we say ignore event and put event ID in there. And that's going to ignore any incoming MIDI notes. Now if we want to also ignore controller data, we can do exactly the same thing, but instead of it being on note, we're going to put on controller. So this is a controller callback, and instead of it saying on event, we're just going to say ignore controller there. And then if I hit F5, paste this into Kontakt, we get our switch there. And if I play now, let me just put the volume back up. If I play now, we'll hear some notes. If I hit the mute button, we're now not going to hear any notes, and our voice count isn't affected. We can see the MIDI data coming in here, but once it gets processed by our script, it doesn't play back any samples. So this is just a slightly more efficient way. Now, if you don't want to automate by right-clicking, if I set this up to my mod wheel, oh, hang on a minute, we're blocking MIDI data, so that won't work. Okay, there we go. If I can now control this via the mod wheel, so a value above 65 is on, a value below is off. And that's great, but you might not want to control it via CC, you might rather control it via a key switch. So to set that up is quite easy. What we do is, we can see we've got some spare keys down here at the bottom of the range, so we'll use this one, this is C0. So if we just declare a constant, and we'll call it key switch, and we'll give it a value of 24, which is the MIDI note number for C0. And then before we ignore any data, before we're ignoring incoming MIDI notes, we're going to say if the note that's pressed is the key switch, we're going to toggle our mute button. So there's two ways to do this. We could say if mute button is 0, mute button is 1, so we could just toggle it like that, or we can use and then we'd need an else to toggle it the other way. But what we can do is a really quick, just a simple little thing. If we just go mute button equals 1 minus the mute button. So what this is doing, we're saying if the incoming note, hang on, I've got a spelling mistake there. There we go. If the incoming note, the event note, is the same note number as our key switch, 24, then we want to take the mute button is going to equal 1 minus its current value. So if the mute button is currently 0, it's going to be 1 minus 0, so it's going to be 1. So we're going to flip the value from 0 to 1. And if the mute button's already on 1, it's going to be 1 minus 1, so it's going to be 0. So it's a quick way of doing a toggle. The only other thing we need to do is set the colour of that key switch so we can see it on the keyboard. So we're going to say set key color, and that's our key switch, and we'll make it red. There's red. There it is. Okay, and now if I paste this into Kontakt, we've now got a nice red or pink coloured key switch on the keyboard here, and because we put this bit of code where we're checking for the key switch before we're ignoring incoming MIDI data, that's important, it will toggle the key switch regardless of if, will toggle the mute button, sorry, regardless of if that mute button is already on or off. So if I hit that switch, we can see the switch on the interface turns on and off. Okay, let's bypass this script for now, and we're going to look at a way now that you can do this for any number of instruments in your Kontakt setup. Alright guys, now let's look at a way we can handle multiple instruments with a single script. So far we've been doing a script that you can drop into any of your instruments, and now we'll do one that will work across as many as you can load into Kontakt, which is about 63 if you're using all the different banks. 64, isn't it? Right, to open up the multi-script editor, which is what we're going to be using, you click on this scroll icon here, and we get a drop down which looks very similar to our usual instrument script header, and then you click edit, and we can type our multi-scripts in here. Now multi-scripts work as a MIDI processor. They process incoming MIDI data, and that's pretty much all they do. We don't deal with any of the sort of engine parameter type stuff in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to check what channel the incoming MIDI data is on, and we're going to have a button for each channel. And if that button is active, we're going to say don't allow this MIDI data to go through, block the MIDI data. So our instrument here is currently on Omni, so let's change that to be on 1. So this is on channel 1, so it's the incoming channel that we're blocking though, not the channel you've got set down here. But usually they'll be the same. So if your keyboard's set to channel 1, it will play channel 1. And now if I change this to channel 2, I'm playing the keyboard now, but we're not going to see anything happening because my keyboard is only outputting channel 1 data. So yeah, we'll have a series of buttons across here, one for each channel. If you activate the button, it blocks incoming data from that channel. So that's the idea. Let's go and write the script. So let's create a new one. Start off in a similar way how we did before. We're going to need one switch per channel here. So we'll just call them 0, 1 and 2. The reason we're starting at 0 and not 1, 2, 3 is because the MIDI channels, if we're going, let's say we had 16 MIDI channels, it would go 0 to 15. So we'll do our switches to match. Now in Kontakt, because we have the multiple banks, you can actually go from 0 to 63 to address every instrument. I don't know if you can fit that many controls on the interface, but you can certainly have a go if you want to do all 63 controls. Okay, and we're going to, I'll leave it there for now actually in that section. So the next thing we need to do is check the what data is coming in and decide what to do with it. And in a multi-script, we have a new callback called MIDI on MIDI, or on MIDI in. On MIDI in. And this reacts to any incoming MIDI data, be it key switches or continuous controllers. So what we've got to say is, if the MIDI data coming in is on a channel and that channel's switch is active. So we'd say if, I'm just going to write this in a kind of pseudocode. So we'd say if MIDI channel is 1 or 0, let's keep it proper, and switch 0 is on, then block the data. So that's the idea, that's what we want it to achieve. And we could do it like this, and we could write an if statement for every single switch, but that's pretty inefficient from the point of view of writing code and managing code. So we're going to do it in a slightly more efficient way. Now the MIDI channels that the data comes in on are stored in a variable, in the same way that event note and event ID is automatically assigned by Kontakt Kontakt also assigns one called MIDI channel, and if I write it in capitals in this editor, it's going to be highlighted as a sort of brown sandy colour, and that's to show it's a built-in variable. So with this we can instantly find out the MIDI channel of any incoming data, and it's always going to start at 0. So using that we can actually get it to check the value of the switches for us. So we can say if the MIDI channel is 0, then it's going to go to switch 0 automatically. To do that we're going to use an array. So I'm going to declare an array, we're going to call it switch IDs, and we're going to give it 3 elements because we have 3 buttons. If you had more buttons, you give it more elements. And we're going to store the UI IDs of each switch in this array. So switch ID 0 is going to be the ID of switch 0. So we use get UI ID to provide the ID for us. And do the same for 1 and 2. So now we've got all the IDs of all the switches in an array, and they are indexed 0, 1 and 2, and the incoming MIDI channel is going to be 0, 1 and 2. So we can start to fill in the blanks on our if statement here. I'll delete that because that was just to demonstrate. So we want to say if MIDI channel 0 and switch 0 equals on. Well, in our case we're going to have, instead of having it switch 0, it'll be switch and then whatever the MIDI channel is. And basically all we've got to do is check the value of the switch. And usually we could go switch 0 equals 1 or switch 0 equals 0. But we can't do that when we're using UI IDs to refer to our switches. We've got to use a command called get control par, and then the control parameter we're after is the value. Control par value. And this will just give us the value of the switch if it's on or off. And you can see here it's automatically put this in for me, UI ID. So you give it the ID of a switch, it gives you the value. And the IDs are in our switch IDs array. And which ID do we want? Well, we want the ID of the switch for the incoming MIDI channel. So we can just put MIDI channel in there. And then we say equals 1. And then now all we've got to do is block the incoming MIDI data. And in the multi-script we have an extra command called ignore MIDI. And if that's all typed correctly, I haven't made any spelling mistakes, I should be able to hit F5 and paste this into Kontakt and it should work just fine. So there we go, got our 3 switches here. Again, the names have been scrambled because I'm using the compact variables option in Sublime Text, so don't worry about that. And if I hit this, if I place them on the keyboard, we should hear the samples coming through. And then if I hit the first button, which is for channel 1, and now I'm playing on the keyboard, but no MIDI data is getting through to our instrument, which is on channel 1. However, if I switch my keyboard to channel 2, okay, so my keyboard's now outputting on channel 2, and if I change this to receive on channel 2, actually we can set that to receive on Omni. So it's getting the data now, but if I block channel 2, and now I'm playing and we don't get any sound, and I can even unmute channel 1 and still no sound because all the data is going from my keyboard on channel 2. So you can have as many instruments as you want loaded, and what you'd usually do is have one coming in on channel 1, and the next one on channel 2, and then 3 and so on. And obviously I've only done 3 buttons here, but if you want to extend this to handle more channels, you just have to extend this code, just create more switches and increase that. And this doesn't have to change because this can handle any number. Now there is a limitation with the multi-script. We can't automate these switches by right-clicking on them in the same way you can with the with these ones that we created. So with these we can right-click and go learn MIDI CC on the instrument script, but on the multi-script if we right-click it just doesn't give us that option. So this is a good situation where you're going to want to use the key switch technique we looked at earlier, and you can expand the simple one I showed you to handle all 3 buttons or however many buttons you've got, and you'll just increase the number of key switches. It's going to get complicated if you've got all 63 channels set up and you've got to have 63 keyboard keys and things like that, that's going to get a bit tricky. But for 3, 4, 5, something like that, it's not going to be too much of a problem. But you've still got, if we close this down, you've still got the on-screen controls, so you can always just click them to mute the channels that you're not currently using. Alright, one last thing, you can save this as a preset if you want to just be able to easily drop it into any multi you're set up with, and you can save these as presets as well to be able to drop quickly into an instrument. And when you save them as a preset, they'll appear in this user menu here. Alright guys, thank you for watching. Thank you to the original person on YouTube who asked me this question. I hope this has answered it for you, but leave comments below if there's anything else you want to find out. And thank you, and I'll see you again next time.